Hi, I'm Philip, and this is me getting ready for DLSS 3. Let me explain. DLSS 3 doesn't upscale the image any further than DLSS 2 does. Instead, it sort of upscales the frame rate by creating new frames between existing ones. So if you were getting 30 FPS, it could potentially transform that into 60. Sounds too good to be true. But is it? So my major worry with it was that it would introduce latency, since it needs to wait until the next frame has been rendered before it generates the frame you'd see before that one. Digital Foundry got early access to the technology and revealed some comparison figures, and sure enough, it's more delayed than were the framerate interpolation disabled, but it's probably not as bad as you might have expected. The delay is measured in hundredths of a second rather than tenths. At best, it's not much slower than DLSS 2 is, and at worst, it's more comparable to gaming at native resolution without DLSS on at all, but at like double the frame rate. So just to rephrase that, the worst of the three examples shown puts DLSS 3 as being the same latency as native, but at double the frame rate. Competitive gamers will want to disable it out of principle and just to use the delay reducing reflex portion of the technology. But for the rest of us who may be using DLSS to improve image quality, a little bit of extra latency might be worth it if we get up to double the frame rate. But this video investigates the other trade-off, and that's the artifacts it might bring to the image. When drawing new frames, the computer has to make approximations and guesses because it's trying to draw things that are occurring chronologically halfway between existing frames. And it will inevitably get it wrong from time to time because it's sometimes trying to draw something that can't be seen. I created 5 clips of varying difficulty to test image interpolation on. The first is a flight simulation, which I think should be fairly easy for image interpolation to handle. The next 2 are me walking across the garden at different speeds, to see how well it can separate me from the grass behind. And then I have a fast-paced clip of CSGO as a demanding example. And then, finally, a nightmare example where I run through some grass, which I expect it to really struggle with because there's so much moving that I don't expect even the best interpolation software to do a good job with this one. I don't have access to Nvidia's interpolation tech, and I'm not sure it can be used on videos yet anyway, so I instead used an existing high-quality AI-based interpolation program called RIFE to try and simulate what sort of glitches we might see and when. Nvidia's methods will likely be different, but still similar enough that you'll know what to expect from what you see in this video. We'll start with a ridiculously low 5 FPS version of those videos I showed you earlier. This is just to serve as an ultra extreme example of image interpolation, far more challenging than you'll likely encounter in practice, just to get you used to what these artifacts will look like. Now I'll use RIFE to try and return it to 60 again. The AI is trying to draw 11 different frames between each existing one, and because that's such a massive task, the resulting issues from this are obvious. So much of the image is disappearing off the side every frame, it doesn't know what to fill the gap left behind with, so it makes the whole area morph and shift about, really distractingly, sometimes even moving in the wrong direction entirely. Motion vectors will help to minimise this by knowing which direction every bit of the screen is moving and by how much, which is something that Nvidia's solution may have better access to than RIFE does in this example, since it's analysing a pre-existing video, or in this case slideshow. The next example is me walking across the screen with lots of wavy bits everywhere to see how well the AI could distinguish between me and the background. And despite being just 5 FPS, it did a great job of not warping the grass around me. Instead, it made me almost invisible, but maybe that's the best outcome we could hope for here. Next, I walked back across the screen at about half the speed, and you can see it does a much better job when there's effectively half the amount of motion between every frame. I don't go invisible anywhere near so much, and it's an excellent example of how image interpolation attempts to smear stuff around to mimic motion, in this instance with limited success. Next is some high-speed footage of me trying to look cool playing CSGO, a very tough situation for the AI to try and interpolate and to make look cool, especially from just 5 FPS. You can see that in some cases it doesn't even try because the individual frames are so different that it thinks it's a different scene entirely. But this is a good thing, because you don't want it trying to smoothly transition between completely different images. Take this shot for instance. The camera cuts from the girl with the wooden acting to Fred Williamson. It's meant to look like this, an abrupt transition. It's not meant to look like this. Dear God. So yeah, you don't want this same effect happening in games when you're going from gameplay to a cutscene or from the game to a menu. Luckily, this should be fairly easy to remedy in-game thanks to all the extra information that DLSS 3 will have access to inform it when it's a brand new scene. As expected, at just 5 FPS, RIFE had no idea what to do with the final example. It's okay with the background imagery, which isn't changing too much with every frame, but the foreground is a distorted, blobby mess. But as the starting framerate gets higher, framerate interpolation will get better for several reasons, which I will attempt to show in this diagram here. I say attempt because it's a bad diagram. I know it is by the amount of resistance that Excel put up as I was trying to bend it to my will. But humour me here and imagine that what you're seeing here is a second of 60 FPS gameplay, running from left to right. Each of these white bars represents a single frame on your screen, and there's 60 of them. Or are there? Yes, there are. 60 of them in 1 second equals 60 FPS. They're all white, meaning that they're all real frames. And until you enable DLSS 3 for the first time, every frame of gameplay you've ever played is currently like this. This is what 5 frames a second looks like when interpolated up to 60. So there are 2 problems here. Firstly, a lot of that second is spent showing AI generated frames, which is a long time for visual bugs to be present on screen for. And second, because the real frames are chronologically so far apart, it means they all look very different from the previous one, meaning that AI has a really hard job trying to generate middle frames without there being big noticeable problems with them. So how can we improve things? Well, if we increase the real frames per second up to 15, it'll help in 2 ways. Firstly, because there are now more frequent real frames, so the differences between each of them are much smaller. And believe me, this goes a long way towards helping AI to generate convincing mid-frames between the 2 closest real frames. And it also helps because now more of the second is spent showing real frames, and therefore less of the second is spent showing AI-generated frames where there might be problems. In short, 15 FPS interpolated will look even more better than you might expect. What's YouTubing done to me? And the flight example is much better. The edges of the screen are still being sucked away, but the effect is far less noticeable because there's now less movement between every frame. And elsewhere in the image, I think it holds the motion of the buildings moving past each other pretty well. The illusion only really falls apart as we get closer to the towers, where it fails to correctly shift the textures and lines that are on them. But we're getting there. Moving on to the first grass example, I no longer go invisible between every real frame. There's a sort of judder to the movement, makes it look kind of like a cartoon, and it's struggling with the flailing snowman still. I suppose it's not really fair to compare it to 60 FPS, we should instead be comparing it to 15 FPS without interpolation, and which one of these we think looks better. It certainly looks smoother. You can tell that something iffy's going on with the frame rate, but it's kind of mesmerising to watch, isn't it? I'm sort of disappointed that the Counter-Strike example is still a bloody mess. You can see what's going on, but the textures all warp and shimmer very distractingly. This is admittedly a very difficult example, with lots of close-up, fast-paced camera motion and repetitive textures where mistakes will be obvious, but it's still a far cry from being acceptable. And this last example is also a mess, though perhaps not in ways that I was expecting. No matter when you pause it, the grass still looks like grass, but in motion its warping is very distracting. With 15 FPS out of the way, we get onto more relevant examples, because something magical happens as we approach and surpass 24 FPS. We enter the realm of movies and TV shows, which we're all used to watching at these frame rates for years already, and which I've spent years interpolating to 60. Because of this, I am well versed in what to expect from frame rate conversion from 24 FPS. I still expect there to be a shimmer around fast moving objects, but for the rest of the scene to look fine. And panning shots look so much better. There is a lot of controversy over whether high frame rates look better in movies. I think it's obvious that more is better, but traditions die hard. Let's try converting 30 FPS to 60. And this is the first relevant example to DLSS 3, because from the benchmarks shown, it doesn't look like it's trying to create more than one AI frame between each real one, even though that would be feasible. But being 30 real frames a second, interpolated to 60, I think these upcoming examples will represent the minimum sort of frame rates that DLSS 3 should be used with. At this point, the flight example looks 99% perfect. If you look in the bottom corners, you'll still spot tiny amounts of warping, but at this frame rate, it's updated so quickly to the next real frame that it's easy to miss. And it's the same affair as we pass between the skyscrapers. If we slow this down, then the problems become more obvious, but at 100% speed, they are still very hard to spot. Both of my walking examples look perfect. Much to my dismay, because I spent an awful lot of money getting a camera that could capture proper 60 FPS. Turns out I could have just interpolated it from 30 instead. Okay, there is something a little bit fishy going on with my hair motion and with the flailing tail of the snowman. What's going on with it though is only really noticeable if I slow the footage down. But had this just been a clip from a random video, I don't think anybody would have looked at this and noticed these things, let alone to think they're errors from framerate interpolation. The difficult CSGO examples still don't look right. It's not so easy to say what's going wrong though. You can just see it, like the textures in the level are vibrating about in your peripheral vision. I'd say the result is passable, but definitely not ideal. In fast-paced shooting games, you'll want at least 60 FPS in the first place. And it's the same story with the final example, where it's still distracting enough that most gamers will take objection to the effect. In conclusion, framerate conversion from 30 to 60 is probably fine for slower-paced titles. At a push, maybe even racing ones, since the artifacts will typically remain around the edges of your screen. But for first-person shooters, you'll still be wanting more. Which is why I will now attempt to convert these Counter-Strike examples from 60 to 120 FPS. Problem is, YouTube is limited to 60 FPS, so it's kind of hard to show you how this looks. I could combine real and fake frames together into one, like I'm doing here, or I could slow it down to half speed, like I'm doing now. Neither really shows how it looks in practice though. Maybe if you double YouTube's playback speed it'll do it, but in case you're unable to see 120 FPS for whatever reason, I'll just reveal my findings. And it's here that I got the biggest surprise of all. I am a big believer in framerate conversion. I am consistently impressed with the results of converting 30 to 60 and similar, but I wasn't impressed with this 60 to 120 FPS. I thought it would continue to hone in towards perfection, but if anything, it simply made the mistakes it made more distracting, even if I could only feel them rather than to properly see what was going wrong. In conclusion, obviously I will reserve judgment on DLSS 3 until I try it, but RIFE's framerate interpolation disappointed me with this final 120 FPS example. Because let's look at what you want from higher frame rates. In games like CSGO, you'd want 120 FPS rather than 60 because it feels more responsive than 60 does. But DLSS 3's framerate boost doesn't make it feel more responsive in the same way. It will only make on-screen motion look more fluid. And that's only worth it, in my opinion, if it doesn't come with noticeable artifacts. Of course, a few things to note here. I'm testing RIFE and not DLSS 3, so chances are it could be different, or better designed to look less distracting at super high frame rates. And also, I've only been converting video files. I still haven't felt how framerate conversion of gameplay feels in practice. I can see many fringe case uses for DLSS 3, like in games where they can't run faster through no fault of the GPU, like in CPU limited games like Flight Simulator. While the GPU's just sat there waiting for the CPU to pump up the next frame, the GPU might as well generate more frames while it's waiting. Jonathan pointed out that it could help bypass games with a fixed framerate cap in place. Imagine older games capped at 60 FPS, or Skyrim where running 120 FPS for real results in physics bugs and stuff. These games could still benefit from framerate conversion, where the alternative would be to be stuck at a fixed, lower framerate instead. Of course, this would require the game to support DLSS in the first place, unless DLSS 3 can work its magic without having direct access to a game's depth buffers and motion vectors. DLSS 3 could also help when it comes to ray tracing, especially in applications like Blender, where maybe you'd rather have half the frame rate, but double the number of rays fired every frame. Like in situations where you don't mind a few framerate conversion artifacts, if it means that you get better looking ray tracing from the first frame where it's displayed. I suspect this is one of the main situations DLSS 3 was designed for in the first place. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic to keep an eye on, and I suppose you've got to remember that DLSS 3 running at 120 FPS doesn't need to look as good as native 120 FPS does. It just has to be better than whatever frame rate it would be running at were the framerate conversion disabled.
That's just to satisfy your curiosity.